You're mid-sentence. You know exactly what you want to say. You can practically see the object sitting on the table in front of you, you know its color, you know what it's used for, you could probably draw a decent sketch of it if someone handed you a pencil right now, and the actual word for it has simply vanished, like a page torn cleanly out of a book you were halfway through reading. Everyone in the room waits. You gesture vaguely, describe it in a circle instead of naming it directly, and eventually someone says the word for you, and you feel a strange mixture of relief and quiet humiliation, wondering, not for the first time, what's actually happening inside your own head. If you have Sjögren's and this happens to you regularly, I want to take you inside the actual mechanics of what's going on, step by step, because understanding exactly where this breakdown occurs changes how frightening, or how manageable, it feels. If you keep leaving appointments remembering symptoms you forgot to mention, I made a Sjögren's symptom map to help you track the full pattern. Comment symptom map, and I'll send it to you. I want to acknowledge something before we go any further, because I think it matters as much as the science itself. This specific symptom carries a particular kind of embarrassment that a lot of other Sjögren's symptoms don't quite carry in the same way. Fatigue is invisible, and dryness is private. But losing a word mid-sentence happens in front of people, in real time, often in exactly the moments you'd most want to sound clear and capable. A work meeting, a conversation with someone you're trying to impress, a moment with your own kids or grandkids where you want to feel entirely present. There's a specific sting to fumbling for a common, ordinary word you've said 1,000 times before, and I don't want to skip past acknowledging that sting before diving into the mechanism behind it. Let's start by understanding how word retrieval is supposed to work in a healthy brain, because you can't understand where a process is breaking down until you understand the process itself, in its complete, functioning form. Finding a word, something that feels instantaneous and effortless most of the time, actually happens in 3 distinct stages, occurring in a fraction of a second, each one handled by a slightly different part of your brain's language network. Under normal, healthy conditions, this entire 3-stage process completes in roughly half a second to a second, fast enough that it feels like a single, seamless event rather than a sequence at all, the way a well-executed magic trick feels instantaneous even though it actually involves several distinct steps happening in rapid succession. Stage 1 is concept activation. This is the part where your brain identifies what you actually mean, the object, the idea, the feeling you're trying to express, completely independent of language itself. This is why you can know exactly what you mean, have a full, rich mental picture of the concept, before you've retrieved a single word for it. Stage 1 is rarely the problem for Sjögren's patients experiencing this symptom, and that's actually a genuinely important, reassuring detail. You know what you mean. The concept is fully there. It's the next 2 stages where things start to go wrong. Stage 2 is lexical selection, your brain searching through its enormous mental dictionary and picking out the specific word that matches the concept you've already activated in stage 1. Neuroscientists sometimes describe this as searching through a vast, densely interconnected web, where related words sit close to each other and slightly wrong words can get activated right alongside the correct one, competing for selection. This is actually why, when this process slows down, you often land on a related but incorrect word first, calling a spatula a spoon, for instance, before eventually correcting yourself, or why a completely unrelated but oddly persistent wrong word sometimes gets stuck in your mouth, refusing to budge even though you know it's wrong the moment you say it. Stage 3 is phonological retrieval, actually pulling up the sound pattern of the selected word, so you can physically say it. This is the stage most directly responsible for that specific, maddening feeling everyone calls, "It's right on the tip of my tongue." You've successfully completed stages 1 and 2, you know the concept, you've even selected the right word in some sense, but the actual sound pattern needed to produce it out loud hasn't fully loaded yet. Researchers studying this exact phenomenon have found that people experiencing a tip-of-the-tongue state can often correctly identify the first letter or the number of syllables in the word they're searching for, even while completely unable to produce the word itself, direct evidence that stage 2 has actually succeeded, and the holdup is specifically happening in stage 3, the sound retrieval step. Here's the mechanism, as best current research understands it. Sjögren's related cognitive dysfunction most consistently and most measurably affects processing speed, quite literally, how quickly your brain can move information from one stage to the next. Multiple research studies looking specifically at cognitive function in Sjögren's patients have found information processing speed to be one of the most frequently and most significantly impaired domains, showing up consistently across different testing batteries and different patient populations. When the connective tissue between stages 2 and 3 slows down, even slightly, you get exactly this experience: the concept fully loaded, the sense that you know the word, and an agonizing gap before the actual sound pattern catches up and lets you say it. If that 3-stage breakdown just explains something you've been experiencing without ever having language for it, type mechanism in the comments. I think there's something genuinely relieving about being able to point to exactly where, in a real, physical process, this is happening, rather than it just feeling like an unexplainable glitch. I want to go a layer deeper on the actual research here, because this isn't a made-up explanation built to sound plausible. It's backed by real, repeated findings. Multiple studies specifically testing Sjögren's patients using something called the Controlled Oral Word Association Test, a standard neuropsychological tool where patients are asked to generate as many words as possible starting with a specific letter, or belonging to a specific category, within a set time limit, have found consistent, measurable impairment in this exact task compared to healthy control groups. This test is essentially a formalized, laboratory version of exactly the skill that fails you mid-conversation, rapidly searching your mental lexicon and pulling out words matching a specific target, under time pressure, without every word tumbling out disorganized or incomplete. One study directly comparing Sjögren's patients to both healthy controls and multiple sclerosis patients, a disease well known for producing real, measurable cognitive impact, found that 60% of the Sjögren's patients studied showed cognitive disorders, a rate approaching the 76% found in the MS comparison group. Within that impairment, verbal fluency, alongside processing speed, attention, and memory, showed up as one of the most frequently affected domains. This is a genuinely important data point, because it moves this symptom from something patients vaguely describe as brain fog into a specific, testable, repeatedly documented cognitive domain with a name and a formal measurement tool built around it. Another research group, using a slightly different battery of neuropsychological tests, found Sjögren's patients performing significantly worse than healthy controls on tasks measuring verbal learning and verbal memory specifically, alongside the same category of processing speed tasks. This same research group specifically highlighted the clock drawing test, the paced auditory serial addition test, and a verbal learning test as particularly useful tools for catching this kind of impairment even in its milder, subclinical form, meaning cognitive changes measurable on formal testing well before they become disruptive enough for a patient to seek out an evaluation on their own. That's a meaningful detail, because it suggests that by the time a patient notices word-finding difficulty severe enough to bring up with a doctor, the underlying cognitive change has often already been building, quietly, for some time. A separate research group specifically investigated a potential biological marker behind this pattern, testing for a specific category of antibodies called antiganglioside antibodies in Sjögren's patients undergoing cognitive testing. A meaningful subset of the patients studied tested positive for these antibodies, which are known, in other contexts, to interfere with nerve signaling, raising the possibility that autoimmune activity affecting these specific structures might play a direct role in the cognitive changes seen in at least some Sjögren's patients, layered on top of the broader white matter and vascular mechanism we've already discussed. This is still an active area of ongoing research rather than a fully settled mechanism, but it adds another concrete, biological thread to what could otherwise feel like a vague, unexplainable symptom. Across multiple independent research groups, using different specific tests, in different countries, the same general pattern keeps emerging. Something about how this disease affects the brain hits verbal, language-based cognitive tasks with real, measurable consistency, not just as an occasional anecdotal complaint. Now, I want to explain the biological why underneath all of this, tying back to something we've covered in more depth in other videos on this channel. Research using brain imaging has found a measurable correlation between the severity of cognitive impairment in Sjögren's patients and the extent of white matter lesions visible on MRI, areas where small blood vessel inflammation, driven by the same immune complex mechanism responsible for this disease's other extraglandular complications, has damaged the brain's white matter, the tissue responsible for relaying signals quickly and efficiently between different brain regions. Word retrieval, remember, depends on rapid, efficient communication between multiple different brain regions handling concept activation, word selection, and phonological retrieval respectively. White matter is quite literally the wiring connecting those regions together. Damage to that wiring, even relatively mild, subtle damage, doesn't necessarily destroy any single region's function outright. It slows down the communication between regions, which shows up functionally as exactly the kind of processing speed and word retrieval delay we've been describing, rather than a complete, total loss of language ability. Think of it less like a single broken component in a machine, and more like a fiber optic cable that's developed a few small kinks along its length. The signal still gets through, the connection isn't severed, but it travels a little slower than it used to, and that small delay is exactly enough to be noticeable in a task as time-sensitive as real-time conversation. There's a second, entirely separate contributing factor worth naming, because Sjögren's rarely affects any single system in complete isolation: sleep. We've covered elsewhere on this channel how significantly Sjögren's disrupts sleep quality, and poor sleep independently, reliably impairs exactly the same cognitive domains we've been discussing: processing speed, working memory, verbal fluency, in people without any autoimmune disease at all. Sleep researchers have specifically found that fragmented, poor-quality sleep disproportionately affects prefrontal brain regions involved in exactly the kind of controlled, effortful cognitive search that word retrieval under pressure requires. For a Sjögren's patient, these two factors, white matter changes from immune complex-driven inflammation, and chronically poor sleep quality, likely compound each other, each one independently degrading the same underlying cognitive machinery responsible for smooth, fast word retrieval. And there's a third factor, one that's easy to overlook because it feels less neurological and more emotional. The anxiety this exact symptom generates can itself make the symptom worse, in a frustrating, self-reinforcing loop. Anxiety and stress are well documented to impair working memory and processing speed independently, meaning the fear of losing a word, arriving right as you're mid-sentence searching for one, can add its own additional layer of cognitive interference right on top of whatever the disease itself is already causing. This creates a genuinely vicious cycle worth naming explicitly. The more a patient anticipates and dreads this symptom occurring in an upcoming conversation, the more that anticipatory anxiety itself degrades the exact cognitive resources needed for smooth retrieval, making the feared moment somewhat more likely to actually occur. This isn't your fault, and it isn't a sign of weakness. It's simply how human cognition under acute stress tends to function, autoimmune disease or not. If understanding that this has at least three separate, compounding contributors, white matter changes, sleep disruption, and stress-driven interference, helped make sense of why some days feel dramatically worse than others, type layers in the comments. Multiple things stacking on top of each other, rather than one single unchanging cause, explains a lot about why this symptom feels so unpredictable from day to day. I want to spend real time on something practical now, because understanding the mechanism is only half of what I want to hand you today. The other half is a genuine toolkit, specific, concrete strategies that patients and speech-language pathologists have found actually help manage this symptom in real, everyday conversation, not just abstract coping advice. The first strategy is one speech-language pathologists call circumlocution, and it's actually something you're likely already doing instinctively, describing a word's function, appearance, or context instead of the word itself, buying your brain time to complete stage 3 while still keeping the conversation moving. The difference between doing this instinctively, apologetically, in a panic, versus doing it deliberately, calmly, as an actual practice strategy, is significant. If you know in advance that circumlocution is a legitimate, recognized technique rather than a sign of failure, you can lean into it confidently. The thing you use to, water the plants outside, rather than freezing up entirely while searching for the exact word. Speech therapists working with word-finding difficulty in other conditions actively teach this technique as a primary coping tool, which tells you something important. It isn't a lesser, embarrassing workaround. It's a legitimately recommended clinical strategy. The second strategy is deliberately slowing your own speech pace slightly, particularly at the start of a conversation or when you're already feeling tired or stressed. This sounds almost too simple to matter, but processing speed impairment specifically means your brain needs a little more time to complete each retrieval cycle. Giving yourself that time proactively, rather than trying to talk at your old, pre-illness pace and then hitting an abrupt wall mid-sentence, can meaningfully reduce how jarring and frequent these moments feel. A slightly slower baseline pace also has a secondary benefit worth mentioning. It gives you a small built-in buffer to notice a retrieval delay starting to happen and smoothly shift into a strategy like circumlocution, rather than being caught completely off guard mid-sentence at full speaking speed. The third strategy is category cueing, a technique borrowed directly from speech therapy for word-finding difficulties in other conditions. If a specific word won't come, mentally moving to the broader category it belongs to, furniture, vehicles, kitchen tools, and then working back down from that category can sometimes jog the specific word loose faster than staring blankly, waiting for it to arrive on its own. This works because it engages stage 2, lexical selection, through a different, adjacent route than the one that's currently stalled. In practice, this can look as simple as silently thinking it's a kitchen thing, it's something you use for stirring, it's got a long handle, walking yourself, step by step, down through increasingly specific categories until the target word surfaces on its own. The fourth strategy is simply telling the people you talk to regularly what's actually happening, in plain language, once, rather than repeatedly apologizing in the moment every single time it occurs. Something as simple as sometimes my Sjögren's makes me lose words mid-sentence, so if I pause or gesture at something, just give me a second tends to completely change the emotional tenor of these moments for both you and the people around you, transforming an awkward, embarrassing interruption into a familiar, already understood pause that nobody needs to react to with concern or confusion. This single conversation, had once, proactively, tends to save dozens of smaller, more awkward in-the-moment explanations down the road. The fifth strategy is external memory support, keeping a small notes app open, or a small notebook handy, particularly for important conversations or presentations, where you can jot down key terms in advance rather than relying entirely on real-time retrieval under pressure. This isn't cheating or giving up. It's the same basic principle as a public speaker using note cards, offloading some of the retrieval burden onto an external tool specifically for the moments where fluent, fast retrieval matters most, like an important work presentation, a medical appointment where you need to clearly describe symptoms, or a conversation you know in advance will be emotionally significant. The sixth strategy, and this one ties directly back to the sleep mechanism we discussed earlier, is treating sleep quality as a direct, legitimate lever for managing this specific symptom, not just a general wellness suggestion disconnected from your actual daily word-finding struggles. If you notice this symptom is measurably worse on days following poor sleep, that's not a coincidence, it's the compounding mechanism we described earlier playing out in real time, and it means prioritizing sleep quality is a genuinely targeted intervention for this exact symptom, not just generic health advice. Some patients find it useful to specifically schedule their most cognitively demanding conversations, important calls, difficult discussions, for times of day when their processing speed typically feels sharpest, rather than leaving those conversations to chance later in an already tiring day. Now, I want to address something directly, because I think it's the single most important reassurance in this entire video. This symptom, as frustrating and sometimes frightening as it feels, is generally distinct from the progressive, worsening language breakdown seen in conditions like primary progressive aphasia or advanced dementia. Research comparing different causes of word-finding difficulty has found that conditions like Alzheimer's disease and specific aphasia syndromes tend to show a broader, more severe pattern of language breakdown, impaired comprehension, impaired repetition, alongside the word-finding difficulty itself, often accompanied by other neurological signs like changes in gait or swallowing. Sjögren's-related word-finding difficulty, by contrast, typically occurs in relative isolation. Your comprehension stays intact, your ability to follow and participate in conversation stays fundamentally intact, and the difficulty is specifically and narrowly centered on retrieval speed, not a broader collapse of your language system. That distinction matters enormously for how you should interpret this symptom day to day. Occasional, even frequent, word-finding pauses, occurring alongside otherwise completely intact comprehension and conversation ability, fits the well-documented Sjögren's pattern we've spent this video explaining. A newer, more alarming pattern, genuine difficulty understanding what others are saying to you, difficulty following multi-step instructions, or word-finding difficulty appearing alongside new physical symptoms like weakness or gait changes, would be a different, more specific pattern worth raising directly and promptly with your neurologist, distinct from the garden variety version we've focused on today. Let's clear up a few myths before we wrap this up, because a topic this personal tends to generate some understandable but incorrect assumptions. Myth: struggling to find words means early dementia is setting in. Reality: as we just covered in detail, the research consistently shows Sjögren's-related word-finding difficulty as a distinct, generally isolated pattern tied to processing speed and white matter changes, fundamentally different from the broader, progressive language breakdown seen in dementia. Occasional word-finding trouble, on its own, with otherwise intact comprehension, is not a reliable sign of dementia. Myth: this symptom means you're simply not paying enough attention, or not trying hard enough in conversation. Reality: the mechanism we walked through today, white matter changes measurably slowing communication between the specific brain regions responsible for word retrieval, is a genuine physiological process, not a matter of effort or attention. Trying harder doesn't meaningfully speed up a biological signaling delay. Myth: since this is caused by white matter changes, nothing can be done about it day to day. Reality: while the underlying mechanism isn't something you can consciously will away in the moment, the practical strategies we walk through, circumlocution, pacing, category cueing, external notes, sleep prioritization, have real, documented value in speech-language pathology more broadly, and there's no reason they shouldn't help manage the daily experience of this symptom specifically, even if they don't reverse the underlying biology. Let's do a quick round of questions before we close this out. Is there a specific test that can confirm this is what's happening to me, rather than just normal aging or stress? Formal neuropsychological testing, the kind used in the research we've discussed today, can measure processing speed and verbal fluency specifically, and a pattern consistent with what we've covered, impaired timed word generation with otherwise intact language comprehension, would support this explanation. That said, for most patients, a formal battery of testing isn't necessary just to explain occasional word-finding struggles. It becomes more relevant if the symptom is severe enough to significantly interfere with work or daily life, or if there's uncertainty about whether something else might be contributing. Does treating my Sjögren's more aggressively help with this specific symptom? This connects directly to research we've covered in other videos on this channel. Some studies have found improvement in cognitive function, including processing speed, in Sjögren's patients whose broader disease activity was brought under better control with treatment, particularly when central nervous system involvement was identified and addressed directly. This isn't guaranteed for every patient, but it's a reasonable, evidence-informed question to raise with your rheumatologist if this symptom feels significant. Should I be worried this will keep getting progressively worse over time? Not necessarily, and this is worth real reassurance. Unlike progressive neurodegenerative conditions, Sjögren's-related cognitive symptoms don't follow an inevitable, one-directional decline for most patients. Severity can fluctuate considerably based on disease activity, sleep quality, stress levels, and overall flare status, meaning a bad stretch doesn't necessarily predict a permanently worsening trajectory. Is there anything my family or co-workers should specifically know or do to help? Mostly, patience and a lack of finishing your sentences for you before you've had a chance to work through it yourself, unless you've specifically asked for that kind of help. A brief, calm pause while you search for a word tends to resolve itself faster than an anxious rush to fill the silence, and knowing the people around you understand that this is a known, explainable symptom, not a sign something is seriously wrong, tends to reduce the pressure that makes the whole experience worse in the first place. Should I bring this specific symptom up to my rheumatologist, or is it too minor to mention? Definitely worth mentioning, even if it feels minor compared to other symptoms you're managing. Word-finding difficulty is a legitimate, documented cognitive domain affected by this disease, and mentioning it specifically, by name, helps build a more complete picture of your overall disease activity, and if it's significantly affecting your work or daily life, it may factor into broader treatment decisions the same way any other meaningful symptom would. Here's what I want you walking away with. That moment, word fully understood in your mind, entirely lost on your tongue, isn't a mysterious personal failing, and it isn't a sign of something catastrophic setting in. It's a specific, three-stage cognitive process, and Sjögren's, through documented, measurable changes to processing speed and the brain's white matter wiring, is creating a genuine, physiological delay somewhere between the second and third stage of that process. Understanding exactly where that delay lies doesn't make it disappear. But it does transform an unpredictable, frightening glitch into a known, explainable, and at least partially manageable part of living with this disease. I think there's something worth holding on to beyond just the mechanism itself. The words were never actually lost. Every single time this happens, stage 1 has already succeeded. You knew exactly what you meant, completely, the whole time. What Sjögren's is interfering with is speed, not knowledge. Your mind hasn't forgotten anything important about who you are or what you know. It's simply taking a little longer, some days more than others, to translate what it already knows into sound. That's a meaningfully different, and I think meaningfully gentler, story than the one a lot of patients quietly tell themselves in the anxious seconds while they're still searching. If this gave you language, ironically, for something that's been taking your language away, share it with someone else who's experienced this exact frustration, or with someone in your life who's watched you go through it without fully understanding what was happening. And if you want to go deeper on the broader cognitive picture, go back and watch our video comparing how Sjögren's and classic dementia actually change the brain differently, since it lays out the mechanism behind today's video in even more detail. Type words in the comments if this explains something you've been quietly struggling with, and tell me if there's a specific cognitive symptom you want broken down like this one next. The word was never actually gone. It just took your brain a little longer to find it. I'll see you in the next one.